totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to the Booked on Rock podcast. I'm Eric Senich. Great to have you back. Really looking forward to talking with this episode's guest. His name is Jim Birkenstadt. Jim has just released a book titled Mysteries in the Music, Case Closed. Jim is also known as the Rock and Roll Detective. He examines the secrets, myths, legends, hoaxes, and wildly inexplicable events that are such an intriguing part of rock and roll history. He spent decades researching the mysteries hidden within the music and the people who made the music. This anthology of popular music's most intriguing stories investigates original evidence and primary source materials in order to challenge some of rock's most enduring legends. In many cases, original stories were hastily prepared or even fabricated by the media, and just as often these legends became frozen in time, mired in hasty or flawed conclusions. Blogs, podcasts, and social media conspiracies have further fueled and perpetuated inaccurate stories in order to create more clickbait for online readers. Many mysteries still exist in rock and roll for the simple reason that many of the surviving participants and eyewitnesses have never spoken out or have never been asked the tough questions. Until now, with Jim's book. Additionally, no one has taken the time to dig through the primary source, documentary evidence left behind. Until now. Jim Birkenstadt is a best-selling author, producer, music historian, and consultant who has documented the history of several rock and roll musicians. He's the founder of the firm Rock and Roll Detective, LLC, which provides content and consulting services to the entertainment industry. He recently was credited for his work on the Beatles' new Disney Plus documentary, Get Back. His last book, The Beatle Who Vanished, is an Amazon bestseller and is being made into a major motion picture. The true story of Jimmy Nicol, who replaced Ringo Starr on the Beatles for 13 days. His life afterwards would become a complete mystery. Jim has co-authored Black Market Beatles, the story behind the lost recordings, Nevermind Nirvana, Goldmine, the Beatles Digest, and edited John, Paul, and Me before the Beatles. He's lent his talent to TV and film productions as well, serving as the historical consultant on several high-profile projects, including Martin Scorsese's Emmy Award-winning documentary, George Harrison, Living in the Material World, The Beatles' Help DVD, the Traveling Wilburys box set DVD, George Harrison Dark Horse Years box set DVD documentary, the Beatles' first U.S. Visit DVD website, VH1 Behind the Music, and Dick Clark's Teen Idol special on ABC. He also appears as an expert on 2 Reels documentary series. So let's talk to Jim now about his latest book, Mysteries in the Music, Case Closed. Jim's going to talk about a late 60s band called the Masked Marauders. Supergroup or masquerade? Did the CIA kill Bob Marley? The Traveling Wilburys, mischief and mythology, the secrets concealed within Nirvana's Nevermind album, and did the Beach Boys steal a song from Charles Manson? And Jim put together his own Spotify playlist for you to check out all the music that he talks about in his book. You can find that on the show notes page. All right, now on to our interview with Jim Birkenstadt. Jim, I've been looking forward to this for a while. Great to finally talk to you about this book.
Great to be on your show, Eric. Thanks for having me.
It's so great to talk to a like-minded fan of rock and roll mysteries and hoaxes and urban legends and all that good stuff.
Absolutely. I have always been interested in these intriguing parts of rock and roll history that involve myths, legends, hoaxes, uncovering the conspiracies and really getting to the bottom of these cases. So I think we have a lot in common. Yeah.
Well, before we get to the book, I read in your bio that you were credited for your work on the recent Disney Plus documentary on the Beatles' Get Back. What an amazing documentary. It's gotten so much press. What was your involvement with that project?
I don't know that I'm at liberty to say exactly what I did, but I would say that what happened was I was working for George Harrison at the time as his historian. He was still alive because this project took about 22 years or so to give birth for many different reasons. But I think the final key was finding Peter Jackson, and he was the perfect person to put that film together in a whole new way that I felt was much more honest. But George Harrison suggested to Apple which at the time was George, Paul, Ringo, and Yoko, that they bring me on to help with some initial research. I would say it had to do with audio research that would sync up with the film footage. And I think maybe a couple of months after George passed away, I was called by Neil Aspinall, who was then the CEO of Apple. And I started working on that project. And I think I worked on it for a couple of years. So that would have been back around 2001, 2002, or 2002 and 3, something like that.
Is it true that there's actually a version Peter Jackson has that's even longer?
Yeah, I think that's true. I saw some quotes from him that he did have a longer version, but, I think Disney had a lot of creative control over length and amount of content, etc. So I'm hopeful that the fact that the DVD Blu-ray has been, the deluxe set has been postponed temporarily, that maybe they're going to add some more material to it for the fans, and maybe they'll also add some of the interviews that Peter did with several of the people who were in the room with the Beatles or on the roof with the Beatles, but weren't included in the Disney 3-part documentary.
Looking forward to that if that does happen, yeah. So now on to the book, Mysteries in the Music, Case Closed. In your introduction, you talk about the many mysteries in rock and roll history and how the line between fact and fiction became blurred over the years, and a lot of that had to do with the original stories, which are hastily prepared, as you say, or even fabricated. And with this book, you set the story straight, and to do that, you had to do some serious work. You talked to people who were there when these events took place. You collected photos, videos, top secret government documents. How long of a process was this, and what were the biggest challenges for you in doing your research?
Well, I think a couple of the issues there was that, I applied to both the Obama administration and the Trump administration for CIA documents related to their work in Jamaica in changing the government from socialist to more of a capitalist system. And both administrations replied to me and said, we can neither confirm nor deny whether we have any CIA documents relating to Bob Marley. So, of course, most of us would read that as, we have them and you can't see them. So I didn't want to stop there because I thought it was a fascinating story of, did the CIA have anything to do with killing Marley, or trying to kill Marley, I should say. And I found those documents, and they were on WikiLeaks. And it's interesting, WikiLeaks, of course, is famous for obtaining documents stolen from our government by various people employed in the government. That was the only way I would have gotten them. And it's interesting, other than filing an appeal and waiting years. But things like that take time. Also, finding witnesses who were there at the time, and especially witnesses who don't really have an interest in the outcome, so that their story is more likely to be credible than someone who had maybe a financial interest, and which could obviously slant their position. And unfortunately, so many people have died since the big classic rock era. And I even go all the way back to 1929 with one chapter with Charlie Patton. So everyone in that story is gone. So it's a lot harder. Then you have to really dig into records, documents, pictures, talk to other historians who are expert in the area. I think it took 5-6 years.
Anybody that you approached that were afraid to go on record?
Well, yes. One Beach Boy was afraid to go on record, and I think everyone I tried to contact through the Beach Boys was very difficult. The manager at the time said that he would talk to me for a half an hour, and I think he wanted a very exorbitant amount of money, and I don't pay people to interview them for a book. And the amount of money he suggested was really outrageous. And so he basically gave me one comment, which is I don't have any direct recollection of any deals between Charles Manson and the Beach Boys. And so I think I repeated that 2 or 3 times in the chapter, mainly just to sort of poke at him for not helping out. But I did find one key person who was willing to talk to me. Well, 2 key persons in the case of did the Beach Boys steal a song from Charles Manson. One was Greg Jacobson, who was actually in the room, had no interest in the financial outcome of any transaction. But he was in the room when the song was discussed between Manson and Dennis Wilson. The other person is Stephen Desper, who was an engineer for the Beach Boys. And when Manson was sent over to Brian Wilson's house to do some more recording, because Dennis Wilson wanted to pitch him to their record label, the Beach Boys record label, and have him do some recordings. Desper went on record and gave me some really interesting revelations about not just Charles Manson's behavior, but whether or not any Beach Boys were actually there recording with Manson, etc., which has been rumored for years on lots of blogs about the Beach Boys.
Greg Jacobson, he saw a lot go down during that whole period, so we'll get to more of that in just a bit. Let's start, though, with the story of the Masked Marauders. This was what Rolling Stone thought at the time, late 60s, was an obvious hoax, yet fans believed every word of it, and even to this day, there are those who are still convinced that this really happened and this supergroup actually existed. You spoke with legendary musician and producer Al Kooper, who's a part of this story. Who were the Masked Marauders, and when does this all happen?
In the fall of 69. And it's funny because there were a lot of strange things happening at the time in rock and roll in 1969. We had the Rolling Stones played the Altamont concert where a murder took place right in front of the stage while they were performing. We had, as we mentioned a little bit, we had Charles Manson's Helter Skelter murders bringing terror to L.A. in 1969. We had the Paul McCartney is dead rumor in the fall of 1969. But what's interesting was, just to set the backdrop here, 1969 was a moment in rock and roll where musical collaborations began to happen. Some were made official, like Crosby, Stills, and Nash came from different bands and worked together as a supergroup. And Blind Faith was made up of members of Traffic and Cream, etc. And so you had these official combinations, and then there were also some unofficial things, like Jimi Hendrix jamming with Traffic, which you could only find now on a bootleg somewhere. So it was an interesting time, and this idea of our favorite bands collaborating at the time was a big deal. And Rolling Stone magazine was this nationwide Bible for all of us each week to know exactly what was happening in rock and roll. And this was, pre-viral word of mouth. Anything in Rolling Stone would be spread at school, in the schoolyard, or passing notes or whatever. And so when this article came out in Rolling Stone, it was a record review. The review stated flat out that the Beatles and Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones had recorded the most mind-blowing supergroup album of all time. And then really a couple of months later, it was called Masked Marauders, and they were the Masked Marauders. And as you mentioned, Al Kooper, well, he was listed as the producer. And so all of us who were young at the time, we were all over this and trying to find the album. It came out a couple months later, but there was this question about authenticity. And, my question when I went into writing this chapter was not just to kind of flesh it all out and let everyone know the whole background of the story, but I also wondered whether there was any basis in reality for this mythical supergroup. And so it was a lot of fun digging into it. I talked to Glyn Johns, who had produced the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Traffic, and many others. I talked to Al Cooper, and perhaps the most interesting was talking to Jan Wenner at Rolling Stone. So it was a fun, a lot of these things are fun and have humor to them, as well as telling people what you find out, in your research. It's a interesting thing to discover what really went on. And, in the book, I reveal what precipitated this whole crazy story that really went viral in the pre-viral age.
And let's get to the story of Bob Marley's death a little bit here. The conspiracy theories that surround his death, well documented, well publicized. They've circulated through the rock and roll community for a long time. You include a fascinating quote from Bob. He had a premonition of an actual event where he took a bullet.
Yeah, he actually had a dream, I think a week before he was shot, and actually saw this dream, and something told him that he should not run for cover or whatever, that he should just stand there. And that's exactly what he says happened, and what others in this kitchen where Bob Marley and the Wailers were rehearsing for a concert 2 days away. And the others in the kitchen who survived the shooting as well said he just stood there. He didn't try to flee, and his chest was grazed with a bullet, and it lodged in his elbow. And I actually think there's a picture in the book of him sitting in the hospital with blood all over his arm. I don't know if it's before or after he was treated. I think it was before, because you would think they would have cleaned everything up and bandaged it. So it was an early picture just as he got to the hospital, I think.
And although he survived that scare, sadly, as we know, Bob Marley would die. Age of 36, May 11th, 1981, after a battle with cancer. He was diagnosed 4 years earlier with a type of malignant melanoma under a toenail. So odd. Did the CIA have something to do with his death? Well, before we get to the conspiracy theories here, why the CIA?
Well, I think the reason these stories started is we have to go back, and I had to look at the whole socio-political or geopolitical situation going on in Jamaica in 1976. Back then, there were these big U.S. multinational corporations, and they were digging up half the island of Jamaica for pennies on the dollar of a mineral called bauxite, which is used to manufacture aluminum. So these were all the big aluminum companies in America wanting to get as much bauxite as they could very cheaply. So Jamaica had gotten a new prime minister whose name was Manley, not to be confused with Marley. And he was moving towards socialism. And he had visited Cuba and, talked to Castro and gotten some tips from him. And then, we were also we weren't comfortable in America because Cuba had let Russia put missiles on their island and they were pointed at America. So, it's so funny how here we are back with Russia again, dealing with them. So we had this Cold War going on, and we did not want another island in the Caribbean to turn socialist. So Henry Kissinger made a trip down there. He talked to the prime minister. He tried to convince him that, we would provide him with a lot of aid and loans and things if he would just continue with the status quo. Prime Minister Manley told Kissinger to go home. He probably told him more than that, but he said, go home. We're not going to kowtow to the United States. So at the time, we had, I think, two people that were like ambassador and assistant ambassador in Jamaica. And Kissinger in the U.S. sent a number of, and this has been documented in government records as well as ex-CIA people, that we sent these CIA agents down there disguised as diplomats. And their job was to disrupt the election that was coming up in December of 76 and try to overturn Manley and bring in a U.S. friendly conservative. and his name was CA Guy, I think, or something like that. So that's the background, and so that's why there's the CIA. That's one reason there's a CIA connection. The other reason is the Island Records decided we need to film this concert because it can be used in the United States when Bob isn't touring, and it could go on Saturday Night Live, or it could go on one of those late night rock shows that they used to have on Saturday nights in America, and promote him that way. And so one of the cameramen was the son of our ex-CIA leader. And so that also created some connecting of dots amongst fans, so that when he was shot 2 days before the election, and the reason for the concert was to bring both political sides together, people thought, well, it had to be CIA because we know they were down there. We know they were trying to disrupt the election. And Bob Marley was seen as favorable to the socialist leader, even though he wasn't taking sides politically, and was using the concert to try to bring everyone together in a peaceful manner. But having a son of a CIA director there made it very interesting for conspiracy theorists to point to that. And then they later believe that that same gentleman was in the house, which I did confirm. He was in the secret hideaway where Marley was, and they allege that he gave a gift of a pair of soccer cleats to Bob that contained a poisonous copper wire that poked him in the big toe, which then ultimately led to his getting the cancer, which you discussed earlier. So there's a lot of little things that people put together, but I really dig into this and get eyewitness accounts and answer the question definitively once and for all.
I get the feeling from reading your book and other books on Bob Marley, he was fearless. He was outspoken. He didn't fear death all that much.
I think you're right. And I mean, he was very religious, and he was, a morally good person, and he didn't believe in political leaders, and he just didn't understand the violence that would go on before these elections took place. He just didn't like it, and he was always trying to get both sides together, and he had friends in both political parties who were leaders, and he just wanted everyone to make Jamaica a better place to live for everyone.
So there really are two big conspiracy theories regarding how Bob could have been murdered.
As far as I could find, there were two main theories. One was the poisonous copper wire that could cause cancer, which he ultimately died of. And the other was that gunman came into his home when he was taking a break. What was actually happening was the Wailers were rehearsing some horn player parts for one of the songs that normally hadn't been recorded with the horns. So they didn't need Bob. So he went into the kitchen to get some fruit. And his manager had just walked in the door. And maybe after a few moments of speaking, gunmen burst into the house. They shot up the whole living room where the Wailers were, firing wildly in every direction. And the Wailers were, jumping behind couches, hiding in bathrooms. And Bob Marley's manager took 5 bullets in the back. And Bob, like I said, got 1 bullet that was lodged in his elbow that was never removed. And in fact, another theory is that ultimately, because the bullet wasn't removed, that he got lead poisoning in the elbow. I go into another deep dive with a doctor who looked into all of his autopsy records and looked at each and every aspect of how and why Bob Marley died.
You also mentioned in the book there was a doctor that told Bob, if you amputate your toe, you're going to have a much better chance of surviving, and he passed on that option.
Right. He was a big soccer player and loved to play soccer wherever they went on tour and at home. And he also loved to dance and spin around on stage. And he felt that if he had his whole toe removed, that two of the things he loved most would be taken away from him. And so I think that's why he declined.
If he did that, would he still be with us today?
I love to think about that too. I mean, there's so many people I wish were still with us today who were so talented from that era. And what would they have done? And, or would they have then all collaborated? And, we've missed a lot.
Yeah.
John Lennon being shot. There's a lot of things like that have happened.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Like the Booked on Rock podcast? Tell a friend and give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You mentioned the Traveling Wilburys in chapter 2, I believe it is, when talking about Bob Dylan and George Harrison. Bob and George teamed up with Roy Orbison and Jeff Lynne to form this supergroup in 1988. And this is another story that I was so intrigued by because I love that first album the Traveling Wilburys did. Second one's good, but it's without Roy Orbison. The first one, I listen to that still to this day, front to back. We have the pseudonyms for each band member. Nelson, a.k.a. George Harrison, Otis, a.k.a. Jeff Lynne, Lucky, a.k.a. Bob Dylan, and Lefty, a.k.a. Roy Orbison. Oh, also Charlie T. Jr., Tom Petty. Your book goes into the story behind each band member's name, and you also go into great depth regarding the use of an alter ego or a pseudonym that dates all the way back to the 20s. You made mention of this early on in this interview, and there's a great story about the man known as the Masked Marvel.
Right. So it's interesting because pseudonyms have been used in popular music at least since the turn of the last century. And I sort of used the Wilbury chapter as a platform to give people a little bit of that background and then bring it up to now. But yes, Charlie Patton had 2 or 3. He's known as the king of the Delta blues from Mississippi, and he had 2 or 3 pseudonyms that I go into detail in his own chapter, and one of them was used as sort of a promotion to get people to buy his newest record. But another reason used by his record company for pseudonyms was he played different styles of music. And back then, it didn't make sense to early record companies, to have a guy that does gospel and blues, because one sings about things that are very moral and the other sings about things that aren't so moral, drinking and womanizing, etc. in the blues. So they wanted to separate that. Plus, record companies early on were licensing recordings and selling them to other labels. And if they had all these multiple names, like 3, 4 names for one artist, it looked like they had a bigger roster than they actually did and had more to sell. And so they would do that. And also same with fans. They might be buying Charlie Patton 3 different records, but not knowing it because there were 3 different names listed on the record label. So you have those things going on. And then over the years, other reasons, for example, George Harrison played on the song Badge, which he co-wrote with Eric Clapton, and it appeared on a Cream album. And back then, lawyers for record labels were told, we don't want to lend out our artists. We want them to be exclusive to us. But that didn't stop artists who were friends from helping each other out on albums. We also know that Eric Clapton played the lead on While My Guitar Gently Weeps that appeared on the recorded version of the White Album. So, but you don't see his name at all in the credits. On Badge, you see El Guitar Misterioso, and that's the pseudonym George used for Badge. So there have been many different reasons. The Beatles used Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in '67, really just to kind of create a fresh start, show that they had matured, that they were coming at a new album as a full artistic concept, from the album cover and pictures and how they looked and how their looks had changed, to posting the lyrics on the back cover, which doesn't seem novel today, but it was novel back then. And then just trying to come up with a whole conceptual album as one complete piece of art.
There's a whole other aspect to pseudonyms too. Rock stars who use pseudonyms when they're checking into hotels, so nobody will. The fans won't go nuts. That's a book idea right there. All the different names they would use. Yeah, but where's this?
George Harrison in the 70s checked in as Jack Lumber, which was a play on his favorite Monty Python skit, the Lumberjack skit.
Yeah, and then Jim Morrison, Mr. Mojo Rising, right? He told Manzarek, Ray Manzarek, if you ever get a phone call from somebody by the name of Mr. Mojo Rising, that's going to be me. And he said if you get a call from Africa, I think, because that was his thing. He was going to fake his death, move to Africa, and nobody's ever going to hear from him again, which leads to a whole other mystery that you know very well.
Another mystery, right?
Where does this newspaper clipping come in for the Masked Marvel? It says "Screaming and Hollering the Blues" by the Masked Marvel, and then it says "Win a free record, guess the name of the Masked Marvel." This is really cool.
Yeah, that's an original ad, and it was used at record stores to get people to buy it. And then there was a little slip where they could fill out a contest entry. So they would buy the record, listen to the record, and decide, who is this guy? Do I know this? Do I recognize this person? And you fill it in, and then you'd send it in. And if you won the contest, you would get usually a couple records. There was one contest for a blues woman, can't recall her name right now, but if you won her contest, her mystery record contest, you received, I think, an actual record player at the time, which was a huge win. But these were used as contests to market a record, and that record ended up selling twice as many as the normal amount of blues singles at that time.
And here we are in the year 2022, and you got a show like The Masked Singer. Similar concept. Yeah. It's a great promotional idea.
People love that. They like that, and then they like the reveal at the end.
The book is Mysteries in the Music Case Closed. It is out now, and we're talking with the author, Jim Birkenstadt. Nirvana's 1991 album, Nevermind. It changed the landscape of radio, music, television, and the music industry after its release. And your book does a deep dive into some very interesting questions. Why was the album essentially recorded twice? What was the story behind the album's original discarded title? How did the hidden track happen? What was the punk song? How did the Beatles, long since disbanded, influence Nevermind? I didn't realize just how many mysteries there were behind this album. Some great reveals in your book regarding the Nevermind album. Talk about this a little bit if you can.
Well, I've known Butch Vig a long time, and he produced the Nirvana's Nevermind album, and he had a studio here in Madison, Wisconsin for decades. So I think I knew him. I knew him about 3 or 4 years before Nirvana ever came to town. But they did come to town, and they basically recorded most all of the songs that would end up on the final record. However, the drummer at that time, Chad Channing, was not really up to what Kurt Cobain was looking for. It almost is a story that reminds some people of Pete Best in the Beatles and George Martin saying, well, I'd like to bring in a professional or something, or we need to do something. And then, they got rid of Pete Best and brought in Ringo Starr. So a similar thing really happened with Nirvana, and it could have been also personality issues. And just as the Beatles seemed to be like brothers with Ringo when he came on board, I think that it wasn't until Dave Grohl came along, and then they also jumped from their small independent record label up to Geffen Records, that caused them to want to put that album out as a more polished record with a new drummer, Dave Grohl. And so that's why, it really was recorded twice, once by Butch Vig in Madison. Those turned out, they were called demos, and they were used to shop the band by Kurt to major record labels. And then they held out for Butch Vig because they were being pushed to use some more famous people. Butch was not famous at all at the time. And he had recorded another band that no one had heard of at the time called Smashing Pumpkins, who also later, became quite big in the 90s. So it's just an interesting story. They Nirvana actually took less money up front in order to negotiate so that they could have Butch Vig come in and produce the formal album for Geffen. And I think it was a great move because it's probably the best rock record album of the 90s.
Hands down, yeah. There was an interesting quote from Beau Hill in a recent interview I heard with him. He produced a lot of the big 80s albums, Rat, Winger, bands like that. And he said, once you have a hit album, you suddenly become the smartest guy in the room. So before that, it's who's this guy? I don't want him. But once Butch Vig produces that album, he knows what he's doing, and he knew what he knew what he was doing all along anyway. But it's all,
I was there one day when he got a call from a very, very, very famous rock star, and the guy said, and I don't want to use his name, but he said, I really would like you to produce my next record, and I want you to make it sound exactly like Nirvana music. And Butch, I was there, and Butch explained to him, well, Nirvana is Nirvana, and I try to produce to what the band's strengths are, and I'm not here to just create carbon copies, I want to find out what the artist is about, what they sound like, etc., and try to just help them reach their creative vision. And so this artist, he basically turned this guy down, and I was flabbergasted.
Yeah.
It was very interesting. Ultimately, this person did record a Nirvana sounding album, but again, you'll have to do your own research on that.
Okay. Yeah, it's
I don't want him to cancel me.
Right. I can't remember who it was, but it was somebody who said they picked up Brian May's guitar. He was hanging out with Brian, and Brian May said, yeah, go ahead, play it. Guy picks up Brian May's guitar, and it is Brian May's guitar. It is all his setup, and he says, it still doesn't sound like Brian May when I play it. That tells it right there. The Nirvana, just with any band, there's a certain chemistry. There's something unique about each individual band. There's no formula for that.
Exactly.
Part of that magic of Nevermind is the pop rock influence there, his love of the Beatles, the double tracking of his vocals. Butch Vig gave you some great insight to this.
Well, he indicated that Kurt, he discovered when they recorded the finished album version in LA, that Kurt was a huge Beatles fan. And that he told me that Kurt told him a story about growing up and listening to his uncle's record collection. And that one time he listened to the Beatles' first album in America that was titled Meet the Beatles for 3 straight hours, playing it over and over and over, which would be about, because it's like a half hour, so that'd be like 6 times. He listened to the album over and over and over to just absorb the Beatles' songwriting, playing, harmonizing, etc., because he really liked it. Then he actually wrote a song called About a Girl right after an early composition, right after he listened to that. The other interesting thing, though, is about double tracking. And Kurt originally thought that double tracking was fake or a sellout or something like that. And he had this whole punk ethic. And Butch said, well, John Lennon double tracked his vocals. And then Butch said, as soon as I said that, Kurt said, okay. And then Butch said he pretty much double tracked all the vocals after that. So clearly the magic of John Lennon continued through Nirvana. And also, if you think about it, later, Paul McCartney jammed with the living members of Nirvana, and they did a song called Cut Me Some Slack. And Paul has always been a big fan of Nirvana. And again, back to your question about, what if certain people had lived? It would have been very interesting to see if John Lennon had lived, if he and or Paul would have worked together with Nirvana. And again, if Kurt Cobain had lived too.
The Batman movie has Something in the Way in it, and now Something in the Way is suddenly a very popular Nirvana song just last night, hanging out with my nephew. He's a teenager and he knows the song. People at work, man, I love that song. What's that Nirvana song in the Batman movie? And I remember hearing it back in 1991 when I got the album on cassette back in those days. And it's just so cool to see that song all of these years later, because it wasn't released as a single back then. And now it's
right.
A new generation of Nirvana fans probably are going to come just because of that inclusion in the movie, which is, I would think, very important now for record labels when they're trying to promote an album or song. Get a song in a movie. People discover those.
That's
those songs.
Absolutely right. A TV show, a series, or a movie, then everybody goes out and wants to, listen or buy that song. And I think that's the single best way to get the word out on a great song. And what's cool is how even like football games now, where they have bumper music going out from, a timeout and coming back in again, they'll use a lot of interesting rock songs from the 90s. And then even on, I heard some political show the other day on the radio, and they were about to talk about Hillary Clinton, and they came in with bumper music by Garbage, and you didn't hear the vocals, you just heard the soundtrack, and it was a song called "Stupid Girl."
Oh yeah, I know that song.
So
yeah.
It's like a subtle sort of way of. They also use it as a subtle way of a message of, here's what we're going to talk about, or here's what's going on in the football game, and it relates to the songs.
Yeah, I noticed too. Yeah, if a game is, say, Detroit Lions game, they'll play artists from Detroit and all that. I know, yeah, they do that. And I hope that this generation of teenagers will want to pick up an instrument, and we're going to get that resurgence of rock and roll, which is that raw singer, guitarist, bassist, drummer, maybe a keyboardist. That's cool. But that straight ahead rock and roll again. I think it'll happen. It's all cyclical, right?
Well, I absolutely hope so. I totally share your thoughts on that, because I would love to see more kids pick up instruments than just noodle around on a computer for music, and create art. I want to see I want to hear the real organic instruments. And I think it's really good for kids to learn to work together, learn to play instruments, and in combination with other people, understanding rhythm, harmony, all of that.
Oh, I remember reading stories. I can't remember when this was, maybe 10 years or so ago, about schools considering canceling music classes in school. You can't do that.
Yes, and for them to delete those things from the budget was terrible. In fact, they've even had studies that say playing a musical instrument improves kids' mathematics ability.
Absolutely.
So that's another positive. As long as we're on the idea of how music is used, that your listeners might be interested that there are many songs mentioned throughout my book that are involved in these mysteries that I solve. And I created a Spotify song list that's about 2 CDs in length. And if they want to go to Spotify and listen to the music and not have to search for it anywhere, it's all in one place under the title of the book, Mysteries in the Music Case Closed.
Oh, cool. Maybe I could just put the link up in the show notes page too. We could do that as well.
Sure, whatever.
One last
I
note.
think people like to hear those songs after they've read about them, especially the 2 songs in the Did the Beach Boys Steal a Song from Charles Manson? Cease to Exist and Never Learn Not to Love are both on there.
We're going to get to that one real soon too. One last note on the Nevermind album, the album cover, the little baby, he's all grown up now, and I know there's some legal issues there. He's trying to get compensated for it, but the cover idea was, as you write, very much Kurt Cobain's baby. It's
true. He kept a notebook with a lot of ideas about, song titles or credits and, or designs for records and things. He would constantly do that. He was very artistic, and he was very good about, jotting down his ideas, his lyrics, etc. And he did come up with the design. He and Dave Grohl were watching TV. They were roommates at the time, and they saw a documentary showing an underwater birth of a baby, and they just thought that was fascinating. So then that I think was a starting point for Kurt to create the design for the album that's now quite famous, of the naked baby reaching for $1 on a fish hook.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. The Booked on Rock podcast is online at bookedonrock.com. Find a list of all the major platforms where you can listen and subscribe to the podcast. Link up to our social media sites. Find out the latest Books on Rock releases. Find your nearest bookstore. And if you want to reach out to us, you can contact us through our website, bookedonrock.com. We're talking with author Jim Birkenstadt, who has just released the book Mysteries in the Music, Case Closed. Chapter 8 is a topic that people are enthralled with to this day. It involves famous musicians, notably Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, and some infamous people, most notably Charles Manson. The title of the chapter is Deal with the Devil. Did the Beach Boys steal a song from Charles Manson? One of the often discussed stories that came out of Manson's mad world was his connection to the Beatles and the White Album. But there is another, his connection to Dennis Wilson. Before we get to this song in question, how does Dennis enter Manson's world?
Well, it's really interesting. You know, the Beach Boys really epitomized this clean-cut Southern California surfing culture in the 60s. And really, Dennis Wilson was the only Beach Boy who could actually ride a wave. But meantime, during the 60s, Charles Manson, who really came to represent the darkest evil fringe of the 60s cultural spectrum, was sitting in prison. And, you know, there's not a lot to do in prison. So he's reading all these books by different people. And these things are like how to improve your life, how to sell a person anything, various religious books and things. And he's taking in all this information about how to basically manipulate people. And then he learns to play guitar while in prison. And Alvin Karpis, who was with the famous old Ma Barker gang, taught Charlie how to play guitar. So he gets out in 1967, and he has this idea, maybe one of the ways I can get my concepts across as a guru now is to get a record deal. And then when I put out music, it will contain these various lyrics and things, and I can get my word out to people easier and make plenty of money. So he has this idea of becoming a rock star. At the same time, Dennis Wilson in the Beach Boys, his brother Brian, who had recorded written all the big hits and was their producer, is now starting to suffer from mental health issues and perhaps taking too much LSD at the time. So the Beach Boys all realized each of us have to step up and provide some songs for the next album, which would be called 2020. And so now it's probably the most difficult thing for drummers to write songs unless they have other background as guitar player or piano player. And so Dennis sort of needed to learn songwriting. So each of them had these needs, but had never met each other. But then one day, Dennis is driving along the highway and he picks up two hitchhiking girls, and they start talking about gurus. And Dennis tells them that his guru is the Maharishi, same one as the Beatles, and that they had, in fact, toured with him, and they, thought he was a very interesting guy. And these girls said, well, we have our guru, and his name is Charles Manson. So he lets them off, and that's the end of that. But they go back to Charlie and say, I think we found you a rock star. And Charlie needs a rock star to try to get a record deal. So one day he picks up one of these gals again, and he says, why don't you guys come over to my house? And they hang out, and then at some point, Dennis has to go off and record with the Beach Boys that night. When he comes home, he's greeted by Charles Manson in his own home, and Manson and these women have all moved into his house. And, this is something that could only happen in the 60s.
Insane.
If you came home today and there was all these people in your house tearing it up, you'd probably call the police or ask them to leave or something. But not back then. So that's how they got to meet and know each other. And Manson, of course, made his girls available to Dennis. And there was plenty of, everyone had marijuana and alcohol and whatnot at the time. So, it was just one big party. And then Charlie started playing guitar. And I actually have a very rare photo. It's probably the only photo of Charlie Manson playing guitar in Dennis Wilson's home. It's like sitting at a windowsill.
I have it up on the screen right now, Jim. Where did this picture come from? Where did you get it?
From Greg Jacobson, who took it himself, and he lent it to me for the book. So I really appreciate that, as well as I'm sure you'll get to a question about him. He was hanging around a lot with Dennis Wilson at the time. He was an engineer. He was a talent scout. He was sort of a jack of all trades. So that, they were friends. And so he was there a lot of times when Charlie and Dennis were together. And, one thing led to another with Charlie. Charlie would just sort of play a couple chords back and forth and then make up words as he went along. And Dennis was intrigued by that because he was interested in creating music. But he also was interested in possibly signing Charlie to Brother Records, which was the Beach Boys label. So he actually hired Greg Jacobson to go into a studio and record some demos with Charlie. And that's what led to this whole chapter title.
And one of those songs he recorded called Cease to Exist, right?
Right.
And that's where we get into the alleged song theft. You write that the media has sensationalized this story over the years. Let's get into this a little bit. You say this may be the most challenging of all the cases you've taken on. It starts with the song Cease to Exist. This wasn't just a song when you look at the big picture. Manson, like you say, he used this as a way to program his cult, to submit to his power. But Dennis hears something different. Dennis is just hearing a really good song.
Charlie started out as this sort of happy-go-lucky, giggly hippie. And, and he was in rock circles. I mean, he met Neil Young. He met the Mamas and the Papas. I think they all ran into him at Mama Cass's house, which was sort of a real meeting place for all the rock stars out in L.A.
Did you hear the story that Jim Morrison may have known Charlie, that Jim Morrison may have come down to Spahn Ranch and hang out with Charlie from time to time?
I've never heard that story, but it's interesting.
That was according to, I think, one of the guys in the band. I don't know if it was John Densmore, maybe Krieger. I don't know, but that kind of got out there. But you never know. It's hard to say. It's so long ago.
I mean, a lot of people went out to his ranch. A lot of people saw him at a lot of these house parties in the 60s. It was just a weird thing. And back then, he was just a giggly guy. So, if you realize that he wrote that song before he went absolutely psycho, in my mind, I think most people would say, yeah, this is a pretty cool song. It's not bad.
But talk about the devil in disguise as an angel here, because he tries to make Dennis think that he wants to bring the Beach Boys back together, cease to exist. That's the whole thing, man. That's the intent of the song. There was a quote from Dennis to a reporter where he mentions Manson. He refers to Charles as the wizard. He is God and the devil. I believe that was the quote from Dennis himself.
Yeah. And I think he said something like, I both fear him and love him. Something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he was an intriguing, crazy guy. But, I think from what I discovered through some of the quote unquote family members of his cult, that were the couple of the males in that cult, they just said, the acid use became so heavy starting around December of 68 and running into 69. And then at the same time, Charlie had seen race riots in LA. And then the White Album by the Beatles came out, and he was influenced by Helter Skelter. And he started to, perhaps through these acid trips, and, it's hard for listeners today to even imagine, how did you go from being a silly little guru to being this murderous, crazy person who thought there was going to be a race riot and blacks would kill all the whites and then Charlie Manson would take over and be their leader. And I mean, all that stuff is so hard to believe, but really heavy drugs can have a very negative impact on people, and they become quite crazy and maniacal sometimes.
Basically, it's more of a lack of a legal presence that is important to remember here. It's it's not like it was this official meeting where they had lawyers all around and they signed off and said, I want to get you. Greg Jacobson is the guy who really gave you some insight as to this because he was there for it all.
Right. Greg explained that the deal wasn't in writing. It was verbal. And, it was a handshake. And there was consideration exchanged by both parties. But at the time, and this gets into the legal end, and I do make an effort to make the legal part of the story understandable for non-lawyers. But at the time, the law that applied was the 1906 copyright law. And in those years, in the early 20th century, they couldn't possibly have imagined all the different circumstances for how to, well, first of all, they couldn't have imagined cassettes or CDs or streaming or any of that in their law. And also back then, legal documents, and I'm saying this as a lawyer, legal documents were very brief and were only a few pages. And nowadays, a contract that I remember being one page when I was practicing law, it's now 20 pages. And the joke is, well, I get paid $250 or $400 or $500 a page now, so we make it longer. That's sort of the joke. It may or may not be true, but obviously the longer a document is and the more little things that happen, the more the lawyer's going to get paid for drafting it. But on the other hand, as case law comes out and settles issues that were never dealt with in statutes and laws, lawyers then react to that and say, okay, well, I don't want that to happen to my client now that this is the codified law, so I'm going to make the document another paragraph. And so over time, these things get longer. So in 1906, there really wasn't anything to deal with a handshake for transferring any type of copyright, whether it be a painting or a song or whatever. That's part of the conundrum. And then the other part is that Manson got interviewed and lived for many more years than Dennis Wilson. So he had the opportunity to tell the media that they stole a song from him. And so that's kind of what has stuck in everyone's mind. And Dennis Wilson, I think he had one quote where he said, well, I gave him $100,000. Well, the $100,000 he gave him is the stuff that when Manson and the family was living with him, he paid for all their expenses for several months.
Including gonorrhea bills, wasn't that the story?
Yeah, gonorrhea bills and special food, and they cracked up his fancy sports car and all these things. But, that was just sort of a flippant remark at an interview, but, it never really came out what happened, and so I was able to get to the bottom of it, and I think people will love finding out the truth once and for all.
Yes, and interesting that you have this in the book that Dennis introduces the song to his bandmates in the Beach Boys just one day after the Beatles recorded Helter Skelter, which is eerie. The song, the song is changed from Cease to Exist to Never Learn Not to Love when it's recorded by the Beach Boys. It's released in December of 1968. It was a B-side to the song Bluebirds Over the Mountain. How long before Manson finds out about the song, and what was his response?
I think he found out about it a month or so later. And it was they did a performance of Dennis's version, Never Learn Not to Love, on the Mike Douglas show. You might have seen it there, or when the album 2020 came out, it was also an album track. So I think that he may have known that the song was going to end up on an album. I don't think he was aware of it when it was a single B-side. So it was either the Mike Douglas show or the release of the album. And then his reaction was he was very angry, and he went into the office and, to scream at everyone at Brother Records, which was the Beach Boys' office, and make a big deal and say, where are my royalties and all this sort of thing. And some people say that he was mad that his name wasn't on the record as credited, to him. But I think he really wanted money at that point because he was starting to get so delusional. He was needing money because they were going to go out and move out into the desert away from Spahn Ranch in preparation for this crazy race war revolution. And, he thought that songs of the Beatles were telling him to do that. He was mad at Dennis Wilson, thinking, you didn't get me a deal. He was mad at the Byrds producer. He was mad at Greg Jacobson. So, I think at one point he gave Greg Jacobson a bullet, like a 44 caliber bullet, and handed it to him because Dennis wasn't home, and said, give this to Dennis and tell him, I know where his kids live or something like that.
Yeah.
So he was really unraveled at that point. Derek Taylor, who was the Beatles publicist in the 60s and then came back in the 90s for the Anthology project. I spoke with him, and actually, no, we conversed via snail mail. And he said to me that he believes that Manson did once call the Beatles after that Helter Skelter and Piggies and all that appeared on the White Album. And, he wanted to talk to the Beatles about their lyrics. And Derek said, but of course, I got at least 10 calls a day of people wanting to talk to the Beatles who were just crazy fans. So he never did get to speak to any of them.
The quotes from Lennon when he talks about that whole thing, he's just like, it's just a song. It's not. And Paul wrote the lyrics to Helter Skelter on a little spiral kiddie ride in a amusement park.
I tried to get quotes from, I got quotes from 3 of the Beatles about that and about songwriting in general. And, it's interesting that people think they can interpret a song and that it has some connection to their life, but it might be completely different than what the songwriter wrote about or what his interest was when he wrote that song.
Yeah, it was like a slide, right? You go around and like a spiral slide that went down, and that's all it was about. Yeah. This whole story with Dennis and the song Cease to Exist is just one, as you say, in a series of events that leads to the eventual Manson murders. And after this, he sets his sights on getting his music produced by Terry Melcher. That went nowhere. The Beatles' White Album, all this stuff.
Yeah.
And then sadly, Dennis's life spirals downward. His struggles with drugs and alcohol continue. He drowned at the age of 39 in 1983. From August of 69, when the Manson murders happened, to 1983, Dennis really didn't want to talk about Charles Manson. And you quote Manson after he hears of Dennis's death. He says, quote, Dennis Wilson's brotherhood took my songs and changed the words. His own devils grabbed his legs and pulled and held him underwater. Oof.
Crazy.
Dennis did not want to talk about it at all. And there are those who were close to him that say that really had a big effect on his spiraling downward. He really couldn't get past it because there were casualties. There were people that were killed. And he felt like, geez, it wasn't his fault, but still his
anyone
conscience.
Who ever met him, I think, felt badly or felt guilty, I never should have talked to him. But however, I think Neil Young still thinks he should have gotten a record deal.
Yes, Neil.
He actually sent Manson over to meet Mo Austin.
He gave him a motorcycle, didn't he? Didn't he buy Charles a motorcycle?
Yeah, I think he did. Yeah.
Man.
Yeah, crazy stuff went on then, and again, there were it's sort of like a switch flipped where he went from being just a silly guru to being a crazy psychotic guy that was telling his people to murder. I mean, it went from peace and love to killing and death. I don't understand it. I don't think anyone will ever understand it, but it was a terrible sort of black mark exclamation point on the 60s, which, was a tough thing to end a decade that way.
You do include a quote, which is on YouTube, of Manson. I think it's when he was interviewed by Diane Sawyer when he talked about the lyrics. Yeah, don't change the words. If you change the words, my shadows are running fast, man. Oh God, you just get the chills every time you see it.
I know he's so creepy.
Oof.
And he didn't like the fact that Dennis changed the words, and that's just the way it goes. You'll have to read the book to understand whether or not Dennis had the right to change the title, change the words, change the arrangement, all those things.
And we've only touched on just a few of these. The book covers Elvis Presley, who really discovered Elvis. Chapter 4, the FBI versus Merchants of Filth. Are there rock and roll mysteries that you've yet to cover that you really want to, or you've tried and just weren't able to get far on it?
Well, the problem is there are cases or mysteries that I would like to delve into, but I don't think there's anyone left alive who could serve as an eyewitness to what happened, or that I could cross-examine, so to speak, to get there, to get to the truth. I think I thought it was kind of interesting that the Led Zeppelin had all this cash stolen from their hotel box after a Madison Square Garden show. But, I would, if it was closer to that time, I would have wanted to interview the manager, all the people that were employed by the manager, because it turns out the box wasn't drilled open. Someone had a key. So either the key, usually in those days, I think you had a key and then the hotel had a key. So either a hotel employee did it or someone in the Led Zeppelin organization did it. But and the police, probably didn't do the best job of investigating because they probably didn't care. It's just, those guys are rich. It's not a big deal.
What year was that? Mid-70s that took place, right?
Yeah, I think it was mid to late 70s. There's so many mysteries or alleged mysteries out there like that I haven't looked at yet. So I don't know whether it's possible to get to the bottom of that. One is, did David Bowie predict the rise of Kanye West? Is one.
Wow, I didn't hear this one. What's the
Yeah, that was kind of interesting. Does Stairway to Heaven contain satanic references, backward masked lyrics?
1973, by the way, that Zeppelin, July of 73. $200,000 in cash taken from their hotel in New York City. Mm-hmm. Are you into the theories of murder plots like Kurt Cobain, did he really commit suicide, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I looked into that a little bit, and I everything I looked at with regard to the police reports and autopsy led me to believe that he committed suicide, and people who knew him and such. And I guess I didn't want to go into that story. I think there's probably been a book or two written about it. I know the guy that I think the private investigator has written a book saying that he was murdered, and
Tom Grant.
Yeah. But I don't know. Some of these things are very sad things that I don't really want to deal with. I have to say that the Manson and Dennis Wilson case was very difficult to read and research because of all the terrible things that Manson did. I really had to stop and start because it can make you very upset, when you have to read about stuff.
Yeah. The book is out through Genius Music Books. I believe that's the publisher we want to mention, right?
Yep. And it's on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com, both websites. It's on the Genius Books website. Mysteries
in the Music Case Closed. It's available, like you say, through many outlets, but you've also got a website for the book, musicmysterybook.com.
Right. And people can download a free excerpt of the book there and see if they think they would like it.
Well worth the read for sure. You also have the rockandrolldetective.com website. What's on that site?
Yeah, that's basically a website that not only talks about the books I've written, but some of the CD and box set projects I've been involved in, the music documentaries that I've been involved in. It's sort of a business card, or like a resume type site where people can see a lot of the things that I've done in the past. My work with the Beatles, Traveling Wilburys, Martin Scorsese, the Reels Network. I've been a talking head on their rock and roll some of their rock and roll mystery TV shows and things like that.
Yeah, your bio said you were on 2 of those. I was curious as to which 2.
2 different, Celebrity Legacies was a show, and another one is called Celebrity Damage Control. And that one, I think, was a Keith Richards episode.
Keith.
That one covered a lot of his heroin events and things and how that, but hopefully the way he came out of it is the thing for people to latch onto.
Brian Hyatt of Rolling Stone just interviewed Keith. I was just listening to it. I love Keith. He really seems like a cool guy. He seems.
Yeah, I agree. Considering
he's just a legendary musician, he just seemed really cool, down to earth, and he's happy to be alive. He's like, I don't know, I can't explain. He was asked, why do you think you've been able to outlive so many of your, friends in the business? And he said, I don't know, he can't really answer it. But he's living for the day. He lives for today. He's like, I always look to work. He's like, if the Stones aren't doing something, then I'm going to do something solo. If I'm not doing something solo, I'm going to do something with the Stones, But I actually got a little lump in my throat because he talked about Steve Jordan is now the Stones drummer. And he was asked if any of Charlie Watts' stuff is in the vaults or just recent recordings that we're going to hear. And so Keith was talking about that. And he said, maybe we'll see. But he pauses and he just says, God damn, I love Charlie.
Yeah.
Him and Mick.
I was very lucky. I was able to correspond with Charlie in the 90s about he was a big band fan.
Yeah.
And I had produced a couple of CDs of like Woody Herman and some of these big band guys that had actually played on the rooftop of a hotel here in Madison, Wisconsin. And so he had gotten a hold of those. And so we corresponded. He was like they're all really nice people, I think.
Yeah. So Charlie was every bit the person that we know him as, is just
what a gentleman.
Gentleman, yeah, polite, not a bad thing to say about anybody. And
a true lover of music, jazz, blues, rhythm and blues, rock and roll. He loved it all.
And that was the thing between.
What a great player.
Oh, I know. Very underrated. There was a great story about how Mick and Keith, when they were doing their solo stuff, it was very important if Charlie liked it. So if Mick played the solo stuff for Charlie and Charlie said it was good, Mick would basically go to Keith and say, aha, he likes it. Charlie likes it. and vice versa. Keith would be like, well, Charlie likes it. Charlie was like the man, he was, when he said he liked something, that meant everything. Like they just wanted to gain his respect.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Social media pages. Do you have any you want to get out there for people to?
Sure. On Instagram, I am at Rock and Roll Detective. On Twitter, I'm at Rock Detective. Facebook, Jim Birkenstadt, but also I have a page where I post a lot of things related to what I'm working on. And that Facebook page is Rock and Roll Detective. Also, if they go to musicmysterybook.com, which is about this book, they can sign up for a newsletter. And I send out an email newsletter about once a month, let them know what's going on.
Yeah, I'll have the links to all of those on the show notes page. Jim, this was great. I'd love to have you back on again down the road to talk about your other books. The Beatle Who Vanished is one that is just super interesting. The story of Jimmy Nicol, who was in the Beatles for 13 days to fill in for Ringo, and the rest of his life became a mystery, and we'll leave it at that. People could read your book to find out the rest.
Well, and Roy Orbison's family bought the rights, and so a movie's in the works for that as well.
I heard about that. Now, what can you tell us? Any specifics, or is it still too early?
Well, all I can tell you is that it's in development, which means that's sort of a stage before pre-production. And in development means there's a screenwriter attached and he's writing the script.
Man.
Or I hope he is.
Yeah. Looking forward to that. You don't know. Yeah. This could be years and years down the road or sooner, but
movies take a long time, and it was really slowed down by 2 years of COVID because it's being made in London, and London was locked down pretty tightly, just as we were at different times. So I think now that things are opening up and hopefully don't close back down again, that it will start moving at a normal pace again. But that was really a tough time for everybody.
Well, Jim, thanks so much for being on the podcast. This was great. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about the book and like I said, I'm looking forward to having you back on again.
Thanks very much, Eric. I really appreciate being on your show, and I'm honored to be on your show because I'm a listener.
Oh, I love it. Oh, boy, that means a lot to me, man. I think I could just close down the podcast now. That's it. I'm done after that compliment. All right, Jim.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Thanks for listening. I'm Eric Senich. Join me again next time for another episode of Booked on Rock.